can see the slides here. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining this webinar on protecting system integrity. I'm very happy to be here together with Alex Rao from KPMG. And thank you for the Scale Up team for inviting us here. And we'll be talking about cyber incident response, cyber incident readiness today. And, we're going to be talking about this in the context of a growing or scaling business, which I think is slightly different than maybe the context would be for more mature businesses, I should say. And we'll get right to it here. I think we'll start off just by way of a really quick intro, not that you need to see our pictures again. But yeah, my name's David Krebs. I'm a partner at Miller Thomson LLP, offices across the country. Myself, I'm based in Saskatoon, but I lead the national privacy, data governance, and cybersecurity practice. And I've been doing privacy and sort of technology work since I started, since about 2008. So it's been a minute. And I'm really happy to be here and joined by Alexander Rao, who I know quite well from KPMG. And Alex, maybe you can say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, David. As David mentioned, Alexander Rao here, referred to as Alex. I am the national partner for cyber incident response here at KPMG, and I've worked with David obviously in the past. We know each other very well. I have been at KPMG for a little bit over 4 years, and I joined KPMG from an incident response firm called Mandiant, and have had extensive experience with helping clients from a post-breach perspective when they have been hit with ransomware or other cyber incidents, but also from a pre-breach perspective to help them to mature and to help them to sort of get better in responding effectively and efficiently to cyber breaches.
Fantastic. Thank you, Alex. And we'll skip to our agenda here, and I think we're going to have a very focused agenda. We have about an hour, and I was going to say this at the outset. We will leave some time at the end for you to ask questions. Now, if you want to ask a question, I think that's probably possible. It should pop up in the chat, and if it works, we'll try to address the question right then and there, and if not, we'll take it after. But again, focused agenda. We'll start off with a very quick introduction, just to sort of set the scene for why we think cyber incident response and cyber readiness and what you need to think about is slightly different in a scaling sort of environment. And then we'll move into a discussion of the current cyber risk and cyber landscape, as well as the legal landscape. And it's trite to say that these things are constantly developing, but it's true. And as we'll talk about in a bit more detail, it's very important to understand the current risk so you can apportion your resources and your approach to cybersecurity in the right way. And on the legal side, the same is true. You need to be able to know what current obligations are both in Canada. Sometimes you have to look outside the country as well. We'll get into that a little bit. And these things are changing right now. Their existing laws are being revamped potentially. We have some very strict laws coming out of Quebec. We have the US, we have Europe. And again, some of this might be old news to some of you, and for others, it might be sort of something that is new. We're going to try to find the right balance here. After that, we'll step into incident response and preparedness. What do we mean by that? And I think Alex and we can share some war stories. And I think what's interesting as well, to talk about how a Miller Thomson and a KPMG, or a David Krebs and a Alex Rao would work together in these types of scenarios, and how we work with clients, and what's from our perspective, what's important for clients to understand, both when a crisis hits or maybe in preparing for a crisis. And at the end, we will discuss a few takeaways that we hope you can take away with you from after.
I'm happy to answer your questions that come out of that, right, David? So yeah, it should be a little bit interactive, but please feel free to ask questions.
Yeah, and certainly, and I think at the end we have both of our contacts on a slide. So obviously, reach out whenever you have a question after the presentation. Okay, so the context for growing companies, and in preparing for this, Alex and I gave this some thought, and I guess I'll kick us off here. From my perspective, the focus, and in my experience, the focus is on growth, not compliance necessarily. Not to say that growing, scaling companies are not, in tune or aren't sort of thinking about compliance and thinking about security, but the focus is on growth. Systems and processes are developing. They're not yet fully mature in many cases. And the amount of data that's owned, processed, accessed is also growing. And, with that, I think customer or consumer trust is also still developing. You're not in many cases, scaling companies haven't been on the market for that long, and mistakes can cost companies quite dearly, especially around security. I don't know, Alex, if you want to add some thoughts on that and maybe some experience with scaling companies in this
Yeah,
context.
I think when we talked about it, right, like when we have a company that's scaling or a sort of a startup or whatever, the real focus, as you mentioned, is on developing the business, coming up or driving that idea that separates you from the others, that brings you in the market. And what we see or what we feel is that cybersecurity is not the core competency of these organizations, right? You have a vision, you want to follow that, and many of these regulatory requirements or cybersecurity requirements are secondary or even not even thought of, right? So this is why David and I are here, sort of to help educate that the why and what the purpose is to keep this in mind, because there could be consequences if that's not considered if a cyber attack happens on these organizations.
Yeah, and I think the lack of in-house expertise, that's not to say that there aren't many very sophisticated and smart people at growing companies. Quite the contrary. It's just in our experience, you don't have a big security team. You don't have a legal department at that stage. Sometimes in very regulated environments, perhaps that's a bit different, in the healthcare space or in when we're talking about fintech or something like that. But generally speaking, you don't yet have the luxury of having experts at the ready. And that can be an opportunity because you can actually, you can choose to hire outside experts, but that also comes at a cost, and you need to do that. You need to obviously be aware of the risks that cybersecurity could pose to your business, and also the expectations, which I do think the expectations, public scrutiny is growing, and I think you'll have all heard of numerous cases this year, over the past few years, where companies maybe have a bit of some egg on their face when it comes to protecting data or protecting their systems, and 5-6 years ago maybe that wasn't the case. There were fewer attacks. People, right? The public didn't know so much. And now I think it's not that everybody's a security expert, but I think when businesses come out and talk about their response and what they're doing, there are more people that are educated now in the public that will sort of say, well, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right, or why did it take this long to do that, and why did they call it a cyber incident when they knew it was an attack? These types of things,
Yeah, especially if your clientele is the general public. If a cyber incident happens to you and you are not able to fulfill your sort of delivery needs to the public, then they will notice that something is wrong, right? And they will ask questions. David, we had cases, and I guess we can talk about. We had cases recently with pharmaceutical companies in a pharmacy company in the news, where they were out for like 7, 8 days, and then the news becomes aware of it, right? Bad publicity and so on and so forth. So I think what you said is that we should have an awareness at least about these issues, and then with that awareness, not necessarily bring that expertise in-house, but ask experts the right questions, how that you can help that organization, right? So
Yeah, and I think, that's sort of just to set the scene, and I think in terms of gathering information, even about what laws and rules might apply, what standards are would apply, and what the latest standards are, because not every business needs the Mercedes, right, or the gold standard. Sometimes good enough is good enough, but you need to be able to assess the risk to your business and the data that you hold, and then match up your security accordingly. So we're going to get into something that I think is quite important to differentiate. So we're talking about cybersecurity. We're also talking about data breaches. What's the difference? Why do we care that it's different? So I'll give it a crack. A data breach is not the same as a cyber incident. A data breach can be a cyber incident, and a cyber incident can result in a data breach, but they're not the same. The law, so PIPEDA, that's the federal privacy law that applies across the country. In Alberta, for example, we have our own, the Alberta Personal Information Protection Act, PIPA, which also has mandatory breach notification. These laws define a data breach in a way that if you had a cyber incident, for example, that had no impact on personal information, you do not need to report under that statute because it's focused on personal information. Now, does that mean you don't have an issue? And not at all. A cyber incident can be devastating without resulting in a data breach. And that is because of, business interruption, loss of other critical data, and that sort of thing. I don't know, Alex, from your perspective, if you want to add anything to the definition. We have the definitions there, but
yeah, I think the
where are they?
definitions are important because oftentimes, and it happens to me too, we use cyber incident and data breach almost the same, but we really have to sort of level set and educate and make sure that we use them in the right context, right? Because cyber incidents happen very, very frequently, very, very often, but they may not lead into a data breach. And the response to a cyber incident versus a data breach is quite different, right? And I think that's, David, why I think that these definitions are very, very important for the audience and as an industry as a whole to understand what the differences are.
Yeah, that's right. And it can be, I mean, from a communication standpoint, many times, if there's not a data breach, it's just a cyber incident at this point. Maybe you don't have to communicate in the same way and with the same haste and with the same scrutiny.
Correct.
Now, that being said, you can have a ransomware attack on your business and it never results in a data breach. Many times it does, but it doesn't have to be, right? And for those of you who've had the misfortune of being part of a ransomware issue, it is quite devastating and it can cripple your business without any data leaving the house. Usually, data does leave the house, but it doesn't need to for it to be devastating. Also, contractually, it depends. So if you're signing on to contracts, let's say you're a data processor, you're a service provider, those need to be read carefully because sometimes it goes beyond notifying of a data breach. It also says you have to tell us whenever you've had a breach of your system integrity. So not only is it the data breach notification that you have to worry about from a regulatory perspective, it might also be that you have to communicate any sort of system breach, which is why it's important to understand the difference between these two.
And I think some regulations and laws make a difference too, right? I think critical infrastructure and stuff is treated a little bit differently, right, than non-critical infrastructure organizations, right? So, and I think the reporting requirements are maybe a little bit different there too, but I leave that up to you, David.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. We can get into that a little bit more. I mean, in Canada, most of the laws are focused on privacy and data breaches. There are some sector specific, and there's a critical infrastructure bill coming down the pike, perhaps, that's still being sort of pushed through the legislative process. But in the US, for example, they have something that basically speaks to what needs to be in place in order to prevent cyber incidents and what to do in cases of a cyber incident. OSFI for banks, there's some regulations around that as well. But when we're and this next slide might come as a surprise to some that we're saying this, but I think we're aligned that organizations can never prevent all cyber incidents. So that's sad but true, I guess. But it's basically, or it is impossible. Okay. And by cyber incidents, we do mean a cyber intrusion. It's very difficult to prevent that. Now, that being said, we feel like all organizations can prepare for incidents. So they don't result in A, significant data breaches, and B, do not result in significant business interruption. And maybe I'll speak to the significant data breach part. And with that, I mean, it's not just the security that's around the data, it's also having good data hygiene. So good data retention policies, and we see it all the time. There's some folder where everybody dumps all the information into. It's not encrypted, it's just sitting there. It's really old data. Maybe for a scale up, it's not that old, but nobody's controlling it. There could be photos in there. There could be, photocopies of passports, you name it. It's not controlled. So data hygiene is a really important step in preparing for this. And from your perspective, Alex, in terms of, how preparedness can prevent huge business interruption.
Yeah, it's interesting preparedness. I always, when I talk to my clients, say that no plan survives first contact, right? So, but does that mean that you shouldn't prepare? No, it doesn't. So, you should still prepare, right? And from a cyber incident response and breach perspective, preparation entails what David just talked about, knowing where your data is, right? But also who do you contact in case of a crisis, right? And how do we respond quickly? And when we come to breaches for organizations that have a plan versus that they don't have a plan or haven't prepared, they all have that what I call the chicken with head cut off syndrome. But organizations that have prepared, they will find way faster the teaming and and fall way faster back into the processes and procedures to respond more effectively and efficiently than an organization who does not have any preparation done in the past, right? So that muscle memory, that training will stick, even though there is that first shock and awe moment, but then they get to it much quicker. And David, to your data hygiene point, like you mentioned, there needs to be policies, but these policies need also to be followed. Numerous times we have gotten on cases where we find these folders that have 10-year-old data from ex-employees that shouldn't be there anymore, right? And that can cause a lot of dominoes and cause extra work and due diligence that needs to be done in those cases.
It's difficult, right? Because we're all pack rats. We like to keep data, okay? And accounting and law firms are obviously, prime examples of that. And we need data, right? Data is important, but data can also be a risk. And so it sort of starts from limiting data collection, then you don't have as much to worry about in terms of retention. And then you need to follow up your retention plans to make sure that data is actually deleted, protected, appropriately, and the right data, and we've got a slide on that a little bit later on, your critical data is protected in a way that is different from the data that is less critical, that you wouldn't worry about if it was posted somewhere. That's important as well, to have a risk-based approach to
Right.
your plans.
And maybe we need to also maybe talk a little about why we are concerned about the data and also about the preparedness from a recovery perspective, right? And maybe not everybody hears maybe about ransomware and so on. And we probably talk about ransomware a lot because those are and we talk about that in the threat landscape a little bit. Those are the cases that we see the most. There's other cyber incidents, but
Sure.
from a ransomware perspective, the way ransomware sort of started was that these threat actors went in and they destroyed the IT infrastructure, which means that you couldn't do your business, right? And the threat actors were extorting money from you to give you the decryption keys so you can recover your systems and get back into business faster. Over the last couple of years, I think as an industry or as a whole, we have become much better in recovery from such catastrophic events, right? Through our experience and expertise from business continuity processes, the threat actor or the ransom payments to threat actors have gone down when it comes to paying for the destruction of the IT infrastructure. But the second piece is that in addition to the destruction piece, threat actors have started to steal confidential data. And this is what David and I are sort of talking about, why we need this data hygiene and why it is important from a data perspective, because more often than not, victims of a ransomware attack will probably pay because of the confidentiality nature of the data rather than the destruction of the business. So there's this two-punch approach that threat actors are taking. And from a common cyber attack vector, the slide that David put on, obviously ransomware is a big one because it has a lot of impact. The second one that we see is business email compromise. And what we mean by that is that a threat actor puts themselves within the email chains of suppliers and organizations and get to the point where they can change payment details on invoices, for example, and redirect funds of payments to their accounts rather than to your supplier accounts. And oftentimes we find out or we hear about this after the money is long gone. A supplier calls the organizer, hey, we're waiting for payment of our invoice. And then the accounting team says, well, we paid this maybe 3-4 weeks ago. And then when you look into it, they find out, oh, the payment account was changed by a threat actor and it went to a different bank account. So you're out that money, but you haven't paid the supplier yet. So we see that quite a bit as well. Third-party risk and supply chain attacks are on the rise. So those are attacks on organizations that you are doing business with and using their services to help to deliver your services to your client. That could be from storing data there or from doing processing of data or things like that. And if they are attacked and down, then you might be impacted as well. And the challenges, and maybe we'll talk a little bit later about that from a contracting perspective, is what do you do if you don't even know if a third party of yours that has confidential data of from your clients has a ransomware attack and they stole technically what is your data. Zero-day attacks we see as well. Those are attacks on IT infrastructure by threat actors that nobody knows about it. The vendors don't know about those vulnerabilities yet, and they're being used by threat actors to gain access into your environment, into your email. Denial of service attacks are attacks to sort of render your infrastructure non-operable from an outside perspective, that don't go inside, but users or your customers can't use your services because they don't have access. Domain name hijacking, corporate impersonation, phishing, employee mobility and disgruntled employees, loss of stolen laptops and mobile devices, all of those can have an impact from a cyber, but also from a data breach perspective, especially the last one, right? Like if you lose a laptop or mobile device that has an Excel spreadsheet of all of your clients with their credit card numbers on it, that is not caused necessarily by a threat actor, but it still poses a cyber and then a reporting risk that David would have to get engaged with.
Yeah, no, and that's right. And I think it's important so on the ransomware side of things, a lot of times when you find out, so when your systems are being encrypted, the data has already left. So the way that these things operate is, and it's, maybe a few years ago, this wasn't common knowledge, and, one would sort of look to, okay, how do we know when did the data leave? When did this happen? When did that happen? Now it's basically every case that I'm involved in, is basically the data was gone before the encryption. So they go in, dwell in the environment, download the data, copy it, and then they pull the trigger on the encryption. So that's how these types of attacks are being carried out now. And depending on the circumstances and what happens after, it might turn out to be a reportable event, depending on the data, depending on how things were, how the data was maybe published. And I think that's also important. A lot of these groups have sites where they publish data. They publish, certain proof packs. They'll teaser packs that other criminals can download and see if it's worth their while. And then there's an exchange of money potentially if they are actually willing to, or these other actors are willing to purchase the data that's been leaked on the site. There's also naming and shaming sites, and all these are sort of their pressure tactics to get organizations to pay and pay quickly. On the policy side of things, this is a good idea to have, a ransomware playbook, right? To know what would you pay? I mean, there's a lot of talk right now in Europe, in the US, in Canada, should ransomware payments be made illegal? I've got my view on that. Alex might have his. Our personal opinions don't matter so much, but let's just say I think it would be quite difficult. I mean, there's certain situations right now where you cannot make a payment, and that is when the recipient of the money is a known terrorist or is on some sort of sanctions list. So it is possible. So again, to prepare for these types of incidents, what would you do if this is a known Russian group that is on some sort of a sanction list? They're threatening to release your data. They don't want to give you encryption keys, but legally you cannot pay them. What do what would you do? And I think it's important to think about these things. They're not nice to think about, but it happens. Now, in terms of business email compromise, they can be quite devastating as well. They can also result in a data breach. Usually not, because they're financially motivated rather than focused on data, but it's possible. It is a system intrusion potentially. And the money that's involved, if you have cyber insurance, I've seen many people surprised when they look at their policy that the losses coming out of a business email compromise are not necessarily covered, or they're covered to a significantly lower level. So that's very, very important to know your, and again, part of preparedness is thinking about insurance, if that's a good fit, and cyber insurance can be a godsend in these types of situations and can really save your business. Comes at a price, obviously, and it's important to find the right fit for your risks. So again, that's part of incident preparedness in my view as well. Okay. And by the way, we're not trying to scare anybody. Sometimes it's easy to end up in this doom and gloom kind of atmosphere when we're talking about these things. But they happen quite a lot, and many organizations have been hit by these types of events, and sometimes they're handled very well and businesses move on and it's not a problem. And other times I know this is doom and gloom, but it is business ending, right? It is enterprise, shutter the doors, it's over. And unfortunately, we've seen situations like that. And it is that kind of an enterprise risk. And it's not only for, I know we've talked a lot about data, quote unquote, data heavy businesses. This, you name the widget. If you're a manufacturer and you can't deliver widgets for a month, you're in trouble, right? And these cyber attacks, they don't discriminate. Okay, real quick, legal and regulatory landscape. There's a few laws in Canada. So Canada is a little bit of a mosaic when it comes to privacy laws and breach notification laws. In Alberta, we have PIPA, the Personal Information Protection Act. In BC, there's also a PIPA. Importantly, BC does not have mandatory breach notification at this point. Alberta does was actually the first law in Canada to have mandatory breach notification in the private sector. There's also PIPEDA, which is quite similar to PIPA, with the exception that PIPA also applies to employee data in Alberta. They can both apply at the same time, so they're not. It's possible for an Alberta business to be subject to both, depending on where data flows are happening. There's Law 25 in Quebec, which enhanced the existing Private Sector Act, came into force in 2023. That law has real teeth. I don't know if there's any businesses here that also have operations in Quebec or that carry on business in Quebec, collect data about Quebec residents, but that is a law with real teeth. We don't know exactly how it's going to be enforced yet because it is so new, but it has European level style penalties and enforcement mechanisms. So yeah, those are quite strict compared to the other laws that exist. There's also some foreign laws that could apply to you. GDPR, you may have heard of, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe. And there's US state laws, California, Illinois, Colorado. There's more and more coming up every day, it seems. So there's not a US law outside the healthcare sector. There's HIPAA in the US. So if you are a business that is in the healthcare space and you're dealing in the US, then HIPAA is something that you would have to get accustomed with. That's also a very strict law and has been around for a while. Okay, so yeah, and all of these laws that I've mentioned, they all have data breach notification obligations. They all say something to the effect of, if you've had a data breach that affects personal data and there's a real risk of significant harm, which there's a legal test for that, but basically it means if you have sensitive data that's been breached and the data is interesting to a criminal, you need to tell the individuals about it and you need to tell the regulator about it. Okay, we've talked a little bit about this already, but what are really the cybersecurity risks to business? I'll mention one thing that we haven't talked about before, and then maybe Alex, you can talk to this a little bit from your perspective. Director and officer liability is something that is quite important. I think there's a duty that directors and officers have with respect to showing that they are putting in place the right processes, the right resources in order to protect the business and the data that the company holds. So that's a risk. If something goes wrong, that is a risk for directors and officers. Yeah, Alex, I'll let you speak to some of the others here.
Yeah, I think the risk to the business piece is what oftentimes gets put a little bit in the background, but is really sort of the first thought that should come to mind is when you're starting how to protect against any kind of a attack on the or sort of threat to the organization, right? So I come from my work with clients is about the detection, not detect, the containment and the recovery from a cyber incident, right? So from a risk perspective, our focus is here. What are the risks sort of to the IT systems or to the employees and to the data? Whereas then when we talk to David, there's more what are the risks to our officers, for example, right? If a cyber breach happens, and to the business in itself from a legal and a regulatory requirement perspective. So, and oftentimes when we think of the risk, I call it, we don't see the forest because of the trees, because we only see the risks that we are aware of. But when you talk to like folks from what I do and what David does from a legal perspective, they're able to help the organization to understand what other risks there are that you not necessarily are aware of, right? So oftentimes when you are in a startup or growing type situation, the risks that you feel is the risk of failure from a funding or from a sales perspective, right? But you don't necessarily think of it from a cyber, from a board, and from another perspective. So I hope David, that's helpful in that context.
Yeah, and I think these issues can have a really, really long tail, which is unfortunate. So you can have an intrusion, you've dealt with it, maybe you've paid a ransom, maybe you haven't, but you've come out of the other end of it, you've contained the incident, and maybe you've done some regulatory notifications, you think you're the worst is behind you, and all of a sudden a customer that you notified says, you know what, we're going to terminate the contract. That happens, unfortunately. And nobody cares about some of these clauses in contracts until you want to get rid of somebody. And then you say, you know what? You actually didn't follow our process that was in the contract. You told us a few days too late, and that's a material default, will terminate. Or listen, we just don't have trust in you anymore. We talked it over, and maybe they had some downstream impact on them when they had to tell their customers about data that they'd lost. They said, you know what? You need to get rid of the supplier. They're too much risk. That's something. Obviously, lawsuits in Canada, we're not as litigious as our American friends, but it does happen. There are class actions, and especially when you're notifying larger volumes of individuals, there is class action risk. And the Life Labs case is obviously a very public one, given how many Canadians were affected, and maybe even some of you on the call got a letter or a check. But these things, even though the number doesn't seem high, somebody will say, oh, I only got a check for $20 or 50 or 7 or 8 or whatever. If you see the impact on the business 7 times, hundreds of thousands, millions, it's significant, not to mention legal fees, internal costs to deal with the and the time it took right away from your normal job can be significant. So these things have a long tail, and that's definitely a risk that you need to take into account. Obviously, what we've seen, loss of what we call, quote unquote, the crown jewels. If you are an IP heavy business, I mean, that information has to be safeguarded with your life, because if trade secrets, patents, if information like that is released, that can have a devastating impact on your business, obviously.
Yeah, you bring up a good point, and I talked about these third-party breaches, and oftentimes you could be the third party too, right? And we have had a couple of cases where we have startups in the fintech space who are providing services to our largest banks in the country, and they have become the victim of a cyber breach. And now those banks who are their customers are putting like really, really strict requirements and ask very tough questions with regards to the cybersecurity posture of that organization, because those banks, they may let it happen once, but they won't forgive a second time.
No, and exactly, your customers, and I've been involved in a few of these cases where if you have very sophisticated customers in the insurance space, banks, they will have their own cyber teams. They will have their own threat intelligence. And if you're a smaller business and you are having to all of a sudden deal with a cyber team from a large bank like that, that can be overwhelming. And they've got more time, they've got more resources. And for you, you're trying to manage the business, and you cannot, this is something, the response is not something you can delegate down too much. That's another important issue to consider. It doesn't have to be at the CEO level, right? I'm not saying the CEO has to be in every call and in every meeting as you're making your way through a crisis. But maybe the CFO does, maybe the COO does, maybe the you might not have a general counsel, but at that level, you will have to have people in the know and to be in the trenches somewhat. So that takes a significant time. It might be 3 weeks, might be 2 weeks, might be 4 weeks. Business email compromise, those incidents, sometimes if it actually ends up diverting funds, there are ways to try to get the funds back. But that will take time. It will take legal resources. It will take resources from within the business. And again, there's the long tail to these things. It's not once you've contained it, you can move on.
David, we said we don't want to scare people away. Like the reason why we're doing this is that we want to provide an education understanding that these are really the sort of worst case scenarios and things that are happening, could happen, and we really want to focus. I think the part of the conversation that we're getting into now, that if there's anything that we want to give away today, is the advice to get prepared for a cyber attack, right? Like you can't prevent it. We talked about, David mentioned it before. There's no silver bullet there out yet that will stop cyber incidents from happening to you. But how do you respond and how do you prepare to a cyber incident? And there's sort of, I mentioned this before, there's sort of two areas from a preparation perspective. One is what do you do before a breach and what do you do after a breach, right? So how can you be proactive? So a lot of the breaches that we see is a failure of cybersecurity 101. Like assess the basics. People from a cyber awareness training perspective are clicking on the wrong link on an email that they shouldn't have, and when they look at it the second time, they say, "Oh, I knew I shouldn't have clicked on it because it's an email that it's a phishing email," right? So phishing emails still we need to pay attention to. They're getting better and better, especially with AI. Gone are the days where the Nigerian prince with spelling mistakes in the email is sending you an email. It's now sophisticated emails that you cannot determine if they're coming from a right sender or a wrong sender. So the links need to be analyzed, that they're going where they're going. Maybe there's technology that you can put in, but you also need to educate your users. That's the second part of training and awareness. We're still sort of coming out of I'm going to talk out of the pandemic where we did a lot of remote working. Remote working is the standard now, right? We have flexible work arrangements. How do we deal with cyber insurance in that scenario? So that have an assessment done. Are the same policies that we have in a brick and mortar scenario valid for when your employees work from home? If the nature of your data is so sensitive that even a conversation could potentially be a data breach, David, there have been cases during COVID where people were listening in, like family members were listening in, right? That could be something that you should think about. So these are these angles that the risks that David was mentioning that can have a long tail of an after effect if we don't think them through and talk to others from the outside who can help to ascertain that risk. Testing your systems from a penetration testing perspective, obviously having backups in a ransomware situation, and then tabletop exercises. Practice, practice, practice from an executive communication level perspective, that you know who to call when something happens, how to react, and maybe even have discussions beforehand. Will we engage with the threat actor, or should we pay or not? Like even in a breach situation, this is where David, from a legal perspective, will give you advice, but thinking about the possible scenarios ahead of time will prepare you better to address the situations when they have. David, I'm not sure if you want to add something to these proactive steps here.
Yeah, no, I mean, basically from my perspective, what you're trying to train is a little bit of muscle memory, right?
Yeah.
And from a technical perspective, you mentioned backups. Just wanted to say the reason why backups in a ransomware scenario can be really good is because if you have good backups, you might not have to pay for the decryption keys, because you can manage to regain your business from backup. Now that doesn't solve the data breach issue potentially, but not every ransomware attack is or involves a theft of critical information or sensitive information. So you might be able to get around paying a ransom by having good backups, right? In terms of, I think we talked about this a little bit in our preparation as well, Alex, thinking a little bit about how are we going to prioritize? Sometimes containing comes at a price, or right? So if you want to get back up to speed very, very quickly, the downside is potentially that you have to, destroy some evidence that might be important in terms of finding out, well, how the hell did these guys even get into our systems? What was the root cause? It might prevent you from doing good analysis on the data that was taken. And so there has to be a balance in the moment. And again, I think it's the Mike, the often used Mike Tyson quote, everybody's got a plan until you get punched in the face. But I still like that one because it's true, but at least you know what to expect to a certain extent. You've done it before. And I think this is where we get to some of the tabletop exercises. So if you don't have a plan, you develop the plan and then you test the plan. So I don't know what your experience is, Alex, but doing a tabletop exercise without ever having a plan maybe makes less sense, right? It's really a test, not a creation of a
Yeah.
plan.
Yeah. We get that question oftentimes to like, let's do a table of exercises. But if there's no plan, then we recommend to do the plan first, because you have to have something that you can follow during the exercise, right? And oftentimes we develop the plans, and which come sort of the run books, and then we leave it sort of with the organization so they can familiarize themselves, and then maybe 3 or 4 months after we've done that, then we run the tabletop exercise, right? Because they have to be familiar with the process. Like, you have to start somewhere, right? But
Yep.
starting, so you need to get a little bit of a head start, I think, with this plan. That's
But
helpful.
yeah, and I think it's a really useful exercise, right? I think it's important to have whoever you're going to be relying on, and maybe it's an iterative process, right? You have your tabletop and you realize, okay, well, that didn't work so well because we didn't have this person here, we didn't have that person, or we didn't have some of our external experts with us. So then you run it again and you have those people that will actually be helping in the room doing the exercise with you. So that,
But that's not necessarily a bad thing, because when an
yeah,
incident happens, the IT director might be on a plane to Hawaii. So what do you do
yeah,
if it's not available? So
yeah,
I often say tabletop exercise are not there to give you a positive experience that you will succeed with whatever the scenario is. It's actually there. We want you to fail and find flaws in the process and in the resources that you have. So if that situation happens to you in a real incident, that you can be prepared and flexible how you would address that situation. So it's all, yeah, you want that to be, you want it to be a difficult situation, I think, from a tabletop exercise perspective.
well, and you can design these exercises how you want, right? You can make
Yeah.
it so let's say Alex runs this, and you could create a scenario where you could say, okay, here's the next sort of curveball for you. Your IT director's on vacation, or yes, you've got Alex Rao as your incident response leader. Guess what? He's sick today. You cannot reach him for some reason. Do you have his backup, right? And I think the plans. This is something I was going to say. It's very simple, but whatever plan you have, you should print out.
Yeah.
And it needs to be printed out. It should not be online. It should be very analog. You should have it in a binder, and key people should know how to access it, because if an attack happens, you might not be able to get online. And then all of a sudden, you might not have a simple thing like an email address contact for, your insurance, your forensics, your legal, whoever needs to be a part of this. You need to get a hold of them, and you need to do it fast. So those are the things you can talk about while you're preparing for an attack. And again, we don't have a slide on this, but also making sure you understand who you might have to communicate with, customers, like understanding your business. If something goes wrong, what are the steps? And you can even go so far as, I mean, some business, they develop template communications, they template notifications, that you have these types of things at the ready. They're not going to be ready to be sent out during an attack, or during a data breach scenario, but at least you have something to start with. And it's also, it gives you a roadmap. Incident preparedness is not a one size fits all, but there's some basics that every business can follow. And I think, Alex, this is a good slide here. We are okay. We've got 8 more minutes. I think we can do this. We've talked a lot already about things that are on this slide, but this is really when, the proverbial,
When it
crap hits
happens,
the fan.
when it
Yeah,
happens. One thing we haven't talked about is cyber insurance, right? So if you don't have cyber insurance yet, then definitely something worthwhile looking into it. And over the last couple of years, cyber insurance have become much more proactive when it comes to helping you as an organization becoming more cyber incident ready, right? So they will ask you, or they will provide you with questions. They also will provide you with certain tools. Some insurance companies actually will offer you a tabletop exercise as part of their policy. So for them, it's all about reducing their risk of you having a cyber attack, right? Because they don't want to pay you out. In turn, you can benefit from that because the tools and the process to go through to obtain cyber insurance will also help you to reduce your risk, right? So I think this is a very nice sort of marriage. If cyber insurance will help you become more cyber aware, more cyber mature, it will not prevent a breach, but it's also sort of a last line of defense from a risk. What do you call it? You use that as the last line of defense from a risk protection perspective, right? But the insurance needs to see that you did all of your due diligence to prevent that risk, and if everything fails, then yes, they will pay.
it's a little bit like, and I think insurance is obviously a great tool, and it can be a lifesaver, as we mentioned earlier on. But it's not a substitute for anything where you can say, you know what, I'm not going to worry too much about my security because I just bought insurance and it'll save. There are many instances where insurance does not cover all of your costs. That's impossible. But also it's unrealistic because in my experience, you will not be able to obtain insurance if you have, completely shoddy processes in place. So, but I think that's a good thing, right? I mean, the process of insurance is actually part of what we're talking about here. And again, when these things happen, let's say you don't have insurance. If you have insurance, you make sure you call your insurer, and your team. If you don't have a team in place, not every business has, a KPMG on retainer, or a law firm that they're using. Insurance gives you sort of some experts at the ready. So you call the insurer. If you have your own external sort of teams, you call them and you call your insurer. If you don't have insurer, you have to make sure you follow your plan. And if you don't have a plan, that's when it can get pretty dicey. But sometimes we've seen very successful responses in businesses that did not have a plan, did not have insurance. But you know what they did? They communicated well, and they phoned critical people. Maybe they had, in my experience, obviously, we as a law firm were involved, and they called us, and obviously I then was able to pull in the people that needed to be pulled in, and to be able to do that quickly. So sometimes we're not saying you cannot have a successful response. You can, but it takes quite a special sort of set of circumstances and leadership that then has a natural ability to maybe deal with crises in a good way. But what you need to think about when something does go wrong, there are legal regulations that apply. You have to think about the contracts you have with customers, how you communicate externally. If you're in a business where that's where PR can be an issue, or if you're in more of a B2B environment, you have to think about talking to your key customers potentially. maybe you have to talk to them because you're not able to deliver, right? So sometimes the press gets a hold of things. That's happened in cases as well, where you think this will stay quiet, and all of a sudden a reporter calls you and says, your data is on the dark web, can you make a statement, please?
Yep.
Now, those are, I mean, I don't wish that on anybody, because that is very, very stressful, because you have a reporter and they will, they want a story, they will publish. And that's another part of this, do you have some sort of media training? Do you have somebody that you can rely on to help you with that? That's also part of potentially of a successful breach response. So I'm mindful of the time here. We have 2 more minutes. We have 1 more slide. And I think we've talked about most of these points already. I mean, threats are constantly changing and developing. That is true. It's your plan from 4 years ago. You have to dust off. That won't necessarily work now. Your resources, I think that's also important. Whoever you had on your list of experts to call, internal, external, your team, that will likely change over the course of time. So you have to make sure that's kept up to date. The legal risk, the financial risks associated with certain incidents, that also changes. So, and why that's important, because the risk should inform how many resources you put towards a a certain item, I guess. And yeah, the rest is I think we've talked about it. Roles of boards, very, very key. And yeah, in a scaling environment, the data is growing, your business is growing, and with that, your risk is also growing in this particular context. So yeah,
Mine definitely is number 2. Like, don't try to do it yourself. Have the phone numbers and emails of people that can help you, right? So
yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that brings us to the top of the hour. I don't know if we have time for questions or how this is going to work.
I don't see any questions yet, but as David said, there's our emails and phone numbers if there's any questions afterwards. And I'm assuming that the audience will be provided this deck, so they have that. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks, David, for bringing me in. And if there's anything else we can do after, reach out to us, or to me. Not to you. So.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everyone.